We recently asked a couple hundred of you emerging biotech leaders about your go-to sources of information when you face tough professional challenges. Your top response wasn't webinars, it wasn't scientific journals, it wasn't trade shows, it wasn't even consultants. Far and away, you said you most often turn to your peers for trusted insight. Enabling a community of peers is what the Business of Biotech podcast is all about. It's also what our new Business of Biotech newsletter is all about. Peer-driven content, no strings attached, delivered to your inbox once a month. Go to bioprocessonline.com/BOB to subscribe. The Business of Biotech is produced by Bioprocess Online, part of the Life Science Connect community, with support from Cytiva. Cytiva also demonstrates its commitment to the leaders of new and emerging biopharma at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. Check that out. I can't name an organization that's doing more than NIIMBL to advance biopharmaceutical manufacturing. NIIMBL is the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biologics and is funded through a $70 million cooperative agreement with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as financial commitments from a literal who's who of big biopharma membership. So it's well-heeled financially, but importantly, it's putting those dollars to good use on an incredibly aggressive list of projects to advance biopharma manufacturing technology and to cement the United States leadership in biopharmaceutical innovation. But we can't win for patients with technology alone. We need people, and that's why in 2018, recognizing the skilled talent shortfall beleaguering the industry, NIIMBL hired John Balchunas as workforce director. In the time he's been there, Balchunas has spearheaded a number of creative initiatives in that vein, and he's here with me today to talk about it. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. As I mentioned, NIIMBL is one of my favorite editorial targets. I've written about NIIMBL several times. Kelvin Lee, your executive director there, I think is one of the smartest guys in the space. He's always got a lot of good things to say. Great insight into what NIIMBL's doing every time I speak with him or listen to him speak. For those of you not in the know, go just Google NIIMBL, NIIMBL, and look it up. When I say there is no shortage of project work going on there, I mean it. You can get lost. Like, you want to go down a rabbit hole, go to NIIMBL's website and just start reading about the project work they're doing in biopharma manufacturing. It's incredible. And like I said, workforce development is a relatively new mantle for. You've been there since 2018, correct, John?
I have.
Yeah,
I have.
But you were brought into the fold. Looking at your resume, going back to like 2003. When I say like you've got this very unique, perhaps unparalleled position in workforce development biopharma. Going back to 2003, you started out as workforce development director for North Carolina Biotech Center. Then you were the assistant director of professional development programs for Biomanufacturing Training and Education Center at North Carolina State University. And then in 2018, you became workforce director at NIIMBL. That's like, it might be fair to say that's unparalleled. Like, there aren't a whole lot of people who, since, for that long have been working in workforce development in a very specific niche industry. So tell me about that. Like how did you find yourself in this very unique niche kind of position?
Well, and it's funny you say that, because like I can also go back to like, I can remember, to meetings like with a couple of people nationally back in around 2006, 2007. And we kind of joked at the time that there were only maybe 20 of us in the country that cared about this sort of thing. And I'd say now that's probably totally different. I think in the spirit, especially with, the current administration's push around the bioeconomy, there's a whole influx of interest in workforce development within the biotech space in general. So it's really cool to see. But like when I look at where I got sort of where a seed got planted, if you will, around kind of workforce development in general, I really have to go back to just bad undergraduate advising when I was in school. I was a microbiology undergrad, and it didn't sort of take at the time. So that wasn't sort of the catalyst right then and there from the start. But I was a microbiology undergrad, didn't have a strong advisor, didn't know any better, didn't know to push for a different advisor. So wasn't looking for interns, wasn't looking for internships or anything like that. And really got to my senior year in undergrad and realized I love science. I love writing about it. I love talking about it, but I hate doing it. I don't even like the way a lab smells and don't have any desire to do it. And so, at the time, my solution was I'm going to graduate and I'm going to run as far from the lab as I possibly can. So I went across campus over to the English department and got my graduate degree in technical communication, and got into the industry and did tech writing for a number of years, both for sort of startup biotech as well as more established in vitro diagnostic and biotech companies. Long story short, got burnt out on that. An opportunity opened at the Biotech Center, and as I started into that role with North Carolina Biotech Center, which is, I guess, the oldest government funded or economic development organization in the world focused on biotech. And so they themselves have some stature, both locally here in North Carolina, but then just worldwide in general. And it was sort of then that I kind of realized, okay, I can kind of see the problems with my own education path and where things could have been different or could have been better had I been, properly mentored, if you will. So that was sort of where when I look back at things now, I guess the seed got planted.
So you're saying just sort of retrospectively, you could reflect on your experience as a student, a biomed student, and where perhaps there were holes, gaps, or there wasn't direction that was leading you towards, understanding what opportunities were before you in biopharma.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Despite the fact, your case is a little bit unique because you just didn't, you said you just didn't like lab. I mean, do you think had you been steered a little bit differently, maybe you would have embraced your time in the lab?
I've thought about that a lot. I mean, I have no regrets. I mean, I wouldn't, I do love the writing piece, and I love that whole side of it. And so I think I would have still gravitated there. But there are pieces of me that wonder, had I had the right mentor to truly appreciate doing science, would I have gotten into science and enjoyed doing it? And I just didn't, and so there is that piece of me that wonders, could I have taken a different path had I had that right advising? I mean, that said, I look back on that now, I see, students in similar situations, and I can see why, and I can kind of offer some guidance and,
Sure.
sort of see where there's challenges that I, just through my own experience.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of work did you do? So as I mentioned, then you went on to assistant directorship at a professional development programs at North Carolina State in the Biomanufacturing Training and Education Center. So what kind of work were you doing there that kind of led up to, I want to kind of get through that work, and then what led to the transition to NIIMBL?
Yeah. So I guess, sort of finishing that whole career arc. I mean, I think when, so even before BTech, when I was at the North Carolina Biotech Center, a lot of my work was working with, that as an organization, we sort of sat in that intermediate space between industry, between nonprofits, between universities, community colleges, state government. And so I think we were in this kind of interstitial space that's bringing everybody together from a partnership space. I really enjoyed that. A lot of my work, in that role was really focused on trying to understand industry's needs, from a training and education perspective. I got to know the folks at NC State. BTech got stood up as a training center, and at its time, it was the first simulated CGMP biomanufacturing training center in the world. So it was another first, here in North Carolina, where I'm based. And I saw that as being just a fascinating opportunity. And so I had the opportunity to come over to BTech, help grow and build their professional development program. A lot of my role at that time was, building off of what I was doing at the Biotech Center in a way. I mean, it was partnership, it was business development. It was a lot of conversations with industry, trying to help, cement, new training programs for them, new short courses, and trying to get that out there for the industry. And, along the way, I think BTech and NC State was definitely always seen as sort of a thought leader in kind of the biopharma education and kind of research space. And so we had the good fortune, not myself, but others at BTech, Dr. Ruben Carbonell and some others, of being involved in the early sort of conceptual thinking and grant writing that ended up being funded as NIIMBL. And so, BTech was always involved in those conversations that were, sort of championed by the University of Delaware and Kelvin. And so, once NIIMBL stood up, I was involved in sort of informally in different capacities, whether it was as, an academic co-chair on a committee, but I was really drawn to the mission. I feel strongly about NIIMBL's mission and sort of the opportunity to change. And it's getting back to the same type of sort of partnership and kind of broad reach that I had within the Biotech Center, of being able to kind of talk to folks within the whole ecosystem, and this time at the national level instead of the state level. And so it was a beautiful opportunity for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a tendency as you're speaking, I'm like, I have a bad habit of wanting to fast forward and cut to chases. And I don't want to do that right now, John, because I want to slow down here and spend some time. But I'll tell you where I want to fast forward to is like the work that you're doing in so many cases, other organizations, other, so-called industry experts on biopharma, biotech, workforce development, and the skilled labor shortage. That work starts and ends with identifying the problem, perhaps measuring the problem, making some statements about the fact that this is a problem, factual statements, like clear facts, like, here's the problem, here's how it presents itself, here are the numbers, here's why it's a problem, but very little in the way of solutions. So like in my mind, I want to go like, let's get to that, but we're going to get to that. I'm not going to go there yet. I'm talking myself off the ledge.
Okay.
What I want to ask you now is that problem part, like before we get to what you're doing and what NIIMBL's doing to solve the problem, how are you defining sort of the problem itself? Like, and how have you been doing that over the course of your career? How's it changed? Like, tell me like what that problem statement has looked like from 2003 until now.
Gosh. Okay. So that's a good question, actually.
It's a big question
because it's,
yeah.
Well, and so, but it's probably a better way to ask the question than to just ask what the problem is now, because, back in 2003, looking at things again in North Carolina, but then also I think some of the stuff that I was involved with back in those days, like in the early 2000s, was also talking to community colleges and others, nationally. And back then, I think the big problem, honestly, was there was so little parity between industry and academia. They didn't talk. And so so the academics really didn't know what needed to be taught from an applied standpoint. And so at that point, I think, at some level, I think the problem was easier in the sense that a lot of the successes in the early years, not just North Carolina, but in other places as well, came from, cementing new partnerships between companies and the academics to really lay out what the needs are, what is needed from a training perspective, and in terms of, GMP and upstream, unit operations, downstream unit operations. What does, say, that technician level person need to know? What does a chemical engineer need to know? What does an entry level, process development scientist need to know? And so I think a lot of that kept people going for years, and sort of, developed a lot of really interesting programs, both at the community college level, the university level. And I think that was really, the problem back in the day. The other piece of that, I think, was also the lack of collaboration between the companies. And so I think, like in North Carolina, we were somewhat unique back in those days, in the sense that we had a lot of biomanufacturing, but there wasn't a lot of true competition between them. And so companies would actually come to the table, and it was relatively easy to break down those barriers that, okay, 90% of what you guys are doing is not proprietary, so let's talk about what's needed from a technical standpoint in training. And so it sort of snowballed from there in North Carolina. But to fast forward a little bit, just to finish that question, like when NIIMBL got started, that was a lot of the assumption was, okay, that's where we need to start. What does industry need from a technical standpoint? What are the training needs? What are the gaps? And I think, like, one of the things that I really strongly think is, in the early years, we realized we know that stuff. Within our community are a hotbed of, community colleges and most of the big research universities that are active in biotech and biopharma manufacturing, focused programs. And so I think we have a good handle on what's needed, from a technical standpoint. What became very clear as more and more large industry members, came onto NIIMBL's, came into the fold and within our membership ecosystem is, it's a numbers game. And what everybody kept saying they need is just, they need more people. And there was and so that became really the resounding message for us. And I think once the pandemic hit and after the pandemic, that's really become what we keep hearing over and over again, is it's just a numbers game. And I can probably go further and say, I think part of the other challenge is just simply I don't think enough young people see biotech and biopharma as a career possibility for them. And I think there's a number of different factors that sort of play into that, but I think that's one of the main barriers that our industry has faced for many years.
Yeah, we're going to get back to that because I want to zero in on that when we talk about some of the actual solution oriented stuff that you guys are working on. You mentioned proprietary kind of perceptions in the earlier days, and I wonder, I'm sure there's still some of that today. In academic oriented labs where people are doing science, perhaps in somewhat of a silo, who don't have maybe the benefit of that North Carolina ecosystem that you saw back in the day. There's probably some perception around like work that we're doing that is in our minds maybe proprietary that NIIMBL has this really unique perspective on because I think from NIIMBL's vantage point, there are several people in your organization that can look around and go, these guys think they're working on some skunkworks, top secret proprietary stuff, and they're not. And we know that. We can share that. Like, is that sort of a barrier to what you guys are trying to do, is like making it clear or communicating to industry just what is truly proprietary and what might not be? Does that persist?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's definitely an issue that we face, but and I can probably comment again more from the education and training perspective, but I think others, on the technical side of what we do could probably say the same thing holds true. I think there's definitely concern about all that, and I think there's definitely concern about, what is the right sort of space that NIIMBL can help drive innovation in particular, in the sense of what do companies want to do in-house versus what do they want to trust to, the ecosystem at large to help raise the bar on. And I think, the education and training space, that's always been kind of the $1 million question. And I don't know that we yet have sort of the solid answer on that, but I can say it is very much a problem. I really think I think probably the one way that I'd probably answer that is, within the educational community, the community colleges have been sharing curriculum and sharing content and sharing their expertise as a community outside of NIIMBL for many years. I mean, since probably the mid '80s when they all got started in biotech. And so that's how they operate. But when you look at sort of the university community, they're much more protective from an IP perspective in terms of what they do in terms of their curriculum. The other factor that is definitely at play, more so I'd say probably in the last 4 or 5 years, is just even regionally. And so, what happens is, in North Carolina, we're very strong. We've won, by stroke of luck and just a lot of good hard work put in. We've won most of the big biomanufacturing site locations over the last few years. And so a lot of the education and workforce infrastructure and sort of secret sauce, if you will, there's folks within North Carolina that view that as a competitive advantage, and we don't want to let that out of the state. I know that folks in Massachusetts feel the same way, and they've got programs that are winners in their region, and they don't necessarily want to share. And the same holds true with California or the Mid-Atlantic, and every region sort of wants to hold on to what they're doing. And I think that that poses a neat sort of opportunity challenge, if you will, for NIIMBL in terms of how can what is that sort of pre-competitive space where from a training perspective where different regions can all come together and work on something. And that's why again I go back to that earlier comment about awareness and just sort of interest in these careers in general is definitely probably the big space when it comes to kind of pre-competitive areas.
Yeah. You mentioned, when you hear from your constituents, the innovators, the sponsors, the biopharma companies who are, in need of manufacturing skill, numbers is kind of, it kind of rolls up to like, we need numbers. We need numbers we need the pool to increase, if you will. How big a problem, like the numbers problem itself, how big a problem is it? Is it, I hear, there's There are doom and gloom outlets, who are saying like this is crisis stage stuff. Is it a crisis, or is it just like a big problem that we need to solve?
I wish I had the numbers to back it, because I think a lot of what I hear, and I can kind of comment on that. It's
hard to quantify, isn't it? Like it's hard.
Is anecdotal, right? But I would definitely say from everything that I'm hearing, it feels like crisis stage. And it's again like before the pandemic, but all the conversations I was having with companies, they almost would always say the same thing. In another 3 or 4 years, another 5 to 10 years, it's going to be a crisis. And then I think the pandemic hit, and I think it's really become become that crisis. And I think I think the pandemic was sort of a perfect storm, if you will, and that, now people have a lot more choice in terms of the work they're doing, thanks to, the world of virtual work has taken off. And, I watch LinkedIn close enough to see that people are hopping left and right. People are leaving the industry to go to totally different industries where they have more flexible work. When you're looking at, something like manufacturing within biopharma in particular, I mean, those are jobs that, the folks that are working in the labs or in the manufacturing floor, they don't have that same level of flexibility. And so how can big pharma make those jobs still attractive when they could be earning just as much, if not more, in some other industry working fully remote? Or, they could even be probably working as an Uber driver. I mean, making good wage in the gig economy. And I think so. There's a lot of new competition, if you will, for where people can focus their attention. And I definitely think it's nearing, crisis mode.
Yeah. Yeah. So you and I were chatting before we started recording, and I posited this to you, and I want to bring it up again, sort of in the context of like where the need is most acute, like where the biopharma need is most acute. So, because I think they're related. So I'd said to you, it's interesting that we would have this conversation about a gap in skilled labor and a shortage of skilled labor in biopharma, when again some of our doom and gloom media outlets are very proud of the layoff trackers that they're running, that are just like, they're rolling like this month there were this many layoffs, and just particularly in emerging bio. So on one hand, there are elements, there are parts of the business that are losing people because we can't afford to keep them. On the other hand, there's this big element of the business where we don't have the talent that we need. We'd be happy to bring those people in. So I guess it's sort of a two-part question. How do you reconcile the whole, like in new and emerging, particularly the layoff, I guess, activity that's going on, and then on the manufacturing side, the skilled labor side, where is that need most acute? Like, can you point to a specific place in sort of the production, the production line where there's just not the skill and the volume of skilled labor that we need?
Yeah,
I know it's a complex and convoluted question. I'm really good at that though.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to lose track of some thoughts here, because I could answer that in sort of a couple different ways. I think, one thing that I'd mentioned to you when we were chatting about this before we started recording, is I think where I see just layoffs as they happen, and especially just the volatility within sort of the emerging side of the industry, really, creating some unique, I think that definitely has created some unique challenges, if you will. And so if we step away from, sort of the manufacturing and production floor jobs and sort of the entry level jobs for a second, we can come back to that. But if we focus on, say, emerging technologies, cell and gene therapy, and I think, and some of these layoffs, and I don't follow this closely, and so this is again coming off, what I see from talking to others that do, and just talking to people that are out there doing the hiring, where things fall short, or where things have created another sort of perfect storm is, on the one hand, people are getting laid off. A lot of the people that are getting laid off are mid-career professionals, and there's this sort of spiraling of their careers where, it's not what it was, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, where you moved into an associate role, climbed the ranks slowly, became an associate 2, an associate 3, became a manager, became a senior manager, became a director. And there's people that, due to layoffs, are kind of jumping from company, left and right, kind of ping-ponging with their career, kind of ratcheting up as they go. And all of a sudden you've got people that are working as directors that have, I'd say less than 5-10 years experience under their belt, and they're still learning how to manage people, and they're still learning how to manage budgets. And I think that's creating whole new challenges for the industry that I think are going to be interesting. I think the other piece, though, that I think is kind of helping, if you will, mitigate some of the volatility, if you will, or maybe it creates it also, within the kind of the emerging, biotech space, cell and gene therapy and all that, is it's also changed, from, I've had some really good conversations with people over the last couple months around, this notion that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all it took was really cutting edge science and a really strong patient story, and that company could attract the people they needed. And everybody, and they would land the top scientific talent with just based on that dream and that vision and mission. The problem now is every single one of those cell and gene companies has just as passionate of a patient story, has just as strong of a mission. And so it's not just the science. And you can cap that off and say they've all got just as strong of a culture and just as many perks. And so how do those companies actually, attract the people they need when everybody is kind of doing the same thing? And I think it's a different level of challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me get back. The second part of that question I want to dig in a little bit more on is where you see the most acute need in skilled labor right now.
Yeah, I think where I see need, and especially sort of in the manufacturing space, maybe the way to answer this is where I see the greatest opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the conversations that we have, and just a lot of the data that we see, our industry is still very focused on the bachelor's degree or the bachelor's, master's, PhD as being the inroad and sort of the gold standard path into the industry. And so, as I mentioned before, our educational community broadly, over the last 20 years has developed a lot of really interesting alternative pathways, if you will. Those have kind of exploded, I'd say, within the last 5 years, where there's now all sorts of neat little apprenticeship programs, badging programs, micro-credentials, 2-year community college degrees. There's all these pathways that don't into the industry or providing, skilled workers that don't require a 4-year degree. And so there's a lot of programs out there that have the potential to crank out a lot of workers. The industry is slow to embrace it. And I think that's where there's really an untapped opportunity to kind of solve so many of these problems. And I don't want to sell the industry short on this, because I think it's a tough problem to unpack, because, on the one hand, you can look at big pharma, you can look at some of the major players in the industry, and they've dropped degree requirements for manufacturing. They've said, okay, whether you've got a diploma or a degree, we'll hire you. And they mean it. And so when you look at, HR policies from the top down, they've dropped degree requirements. I think where things get tricky is, you're talking about changing the biases of every single hiring technical manager within that company before it's really going to, move the needle. And so it's one thing to drop a degree requirement. It's something different for that person who's running a team to say, okay, I'm going to give them a shot. I'm going to give that apprenticeship program a shot, and to sort of wear them down enough where they're willing to take that risk and give that a shot, I think is where, there's still tension, and where there's room for growth.
It's interesting. It's an interesting, I guess, challenge or problem in that, like, I think historically, if you looked at academia and industry separately, you might look at some of the challenges that industry had in, applied skill were rooted in academia not adapting. And now you're saying sort of the opposite of that. You're saying it's on industry in a sense to adapt to. So is academia doing a good job, do you think? And let's break this down. Let's talk about like different levels of academia and what they're doing to sort of prepare that skilled labor, whether it's, in the traditional sense, like you've got to have a PhD if you want to go work for biopharma, which I think is a big part of the perception problem, right? Like even among students, students in school, like in high school. Well, I'm a pretty smart guy, but I don't necessarily want to commit to going to get a PhD to get a job in biopharma. So I'm just out, right? Like, So let me start with the big question. Is academia doing a good job generally? I know it's a generalized question, doing a good job of adapting the applied part to prepare students. And is it true that industry in this case is maybe the one that's a little bit slow to adapt because of those biases you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the academic side of the house is doing or really has the interest in doing a lot. When I started at BTech years ago, I mean, we were the only game in town, really, in the country or the world at the time that was doing this. But I think now there are training academic level, 4-year or above level, training programs really all over the country. I mean, whether it's on the West Coast and internationally. I mean, but there's training centers that have popped up, all in most of the different big biotech regions. There are a number of other, proposed centers that are sort of in the works. They're, on top of that, I think the community colleges have been going strong for, again, 20, 25 years with biotech and bioprocessing or biomanufacturing degree programs. I think their graduates ebb and flow in terms of whether they get placed and who they get placed with, but I think they're there. I think they struggle, they've got some different challenges just in terms of maintaining enrollment with a lot of different, competitive pressure from other industries and that sort of thing. So there's some challenges there. But I think there's a lot out there in terms of, just sort of training opportunities between, the universities and the community colleges. And I think, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've really seen this explosion and kind of resurgence and interest in kind of apprenticeship type models and kind of micro credentials and kind of boot camp style training and all these kind of non-traditional pathways into the industry. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. I don't by any means place, all the blame on industry, because I think that's, I think it's really,
well, that'd be bad business.
There's a lot of different, yeah,
that'd be bad
right.
business.
Well, and I think I think there's lessons learned, there's opportunity within all the different stakeholders, even, within a given company, because it doesn't all fall on one person by any means.
For emerging biotechs, scaling the process development and manufacturing of biologic molecules to clinical standards can be challenging. However, you don't need to go it alone. Don't miss an episode of the Business of Biotech podcast, where we offer insights on regulatory, funding, and other essential topics. The pod is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva, a global provider of technologies and services that advance and accelerate the development, manufacture, and delivery of therapeutics. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. It's interesting, and this is where I want to spend some time talking about like different levels of academia and what they can be doing to improve the situation, what role they play. Where I live in a very rural area of Pennsylvania between Erie and Pittsburgh, right? So if you went down to Pittsburgh, I suppose the community college / VOTech scene would be a bit different than it is where I live in a rural area, where biotech is not even on the radar of the VOTech or community college scene in my general, neck of the woods, if you will. I suppose in, Research Triangle and in Boston and in Philly and San Fran, that would be different. But tell me a bit about that, like where I am in VOTech and, I guess anything other than a four-year college, the focus is on, more kind of blue collar education programs. Are there, like in cities like where, in areas where you are and in biotech hubs, are there like concerted, VOTech level programs for biotech students, and how well, I guess, attended are they?
There are, and So I think the one plug I'd probably give for anybody who's just looking and curious, are there 2-year biotech programs out there, in their region? There's an organization called Innovate Bio. So it's spelled how it sounds. So innovatebio.org. They're a National Science Foundation funded ATE center. So it's basically a consortium of community colleges that are all focused on biotech education. But on their website, they've got a beautiful searchable database of all the 2-year programs out there by region and location and that sort of thing, and a lot of good data out there. So if anybody's just trying to see who's in their backyard, I mean, I think that's definitely worth giving a search. And I say that because like the other thing, and I'm getting into a rabbit hole, and I'll kind of rein myself in quickly, but like when NIIMBL first started up, I was blown away by some of the conversations that I have with our large industry members who, would sit there and pine and wish and say, I wish there was a training center, that would do X, Y, and Z. And they were completely oblivious to the fact that there's one within a commutable distance of one of their sites. And they didn't know that. And I think the fact that they didn't know that is where I see there's a problem. So it's awareness I mentioned earlier in terms of a need for this, students to understand the industry is there, but I think from awareness is also a challenge in the sense that industry needs to know there's training programs in their backyard that they could be plugging into that they're not. Yeah. But yeah, there are a lot of really strong 2-year programs and not just 2-year programs, but I think the community colleges have gotten into apprenticeships and other kind of short course pathways and pre-apprenticeships and other, sort of other models to get, to meet sort of workforce needs. But they struggle. I mean, I think the community colleges struggle, and depending on the region, depending on the college, can struggle from a faculty standpoint. I think, due to this, this whole talent crunch that we're talking about, it's, academia, both community colleges and universities collectively, can't pay the same salary that, that industry can pay. And so they tend to lose good teachers, lose good instructors, lose good leadership to the boom in the industry. And so that poses a threat to some of the community college programs. And so I think there's a number of different challenges. And I think, to folks that have community colleges in their region, I think that the biggest thing, and this is probably a message that I'll keep coming back to, whenever I can, that like industry needs to look to how they can engage folks in their local ecosystem, because, they're only as those colleges are only as strong as, their industry partners. And if they don't have industry advocating for them, those programs will go away. And I think we've seen it happen before. I'm sure it'll happen again. And, when community college administrators are looking at programs, they're not just looking at, the biotech and the biotech boom. They're looking at, how many butts and seats can they fill, and how many people can they crank through and to serve in the community. And, if a biotech program is looking at, being able to fill enrollment for, X number of people, but they can get 3 times as many through a nursing program in a much shorter time frame, or through an IT program, it's a sell. And so I think there's a lot of competition from other sectors.
Yeah, a lot of competition from other sectors, and also at the high school level, we talked a little bit about how kids coming out of high school, or in high school and graduating high school, maybe it doesn't even cross their mind that there's an opportunity to go get a 2-year degree in biopharma that would lead to, or biotech in general, that would lead to gainful employment. I guess what's your perspective, and what work are you doing at that pre-college level, if any? Like, is there work to be done there too? Like going into the high school saying, hey, wake up to the application of this biology that you're teaching in AP Bio.
There's a lot of work to be done in that space. And so again, when NIIMBL stood up, I think we somewhat consciously didn't want to get into that space, because there's a lot of organizations that are in that space. And so, there's organizations out there like Project Lead the Way that do kind of, STEM and high school level engineering curriculum. There's organizations out there, and then some of the large industry members like Amgen or Genentech have programs in their community. And, big biotech companies have sort of community-based programs that they get into the schools and kind of promote what they're doing. I think one of the things that's really been clear from talking to some of the companies though over the last couple of years is, they see a need to kind of wake the students up to the reality that this industry is out there before they'll pay attention to, company X's program in particular. They need to understand that biopharma is important. And I think, so that's why I think there's a lot of untapped opportunity there. And it's something that we've just begun to explore. We've got a high school curriculum that I'd say we're piloting now. We're really trying to see where it works, where it doesn't work, what it works with, because I don't think it works as a standalone piece. I think it needs some other supports to go with it, but we're in the process of piloting that. We're also in the process of just kicking off within the next month or so a whole working group really focused on tackling this problem in particular of, how do we increase awareness, and how can NIIMBL kind of help move that needle at the national level when so much of this is regional. And I think, you mentioned, sort of the K-12 and sort of them seeing these careers as attractive as sort of one piece of the problem, and kind of wanting them to be able to see where they can apply their AP biology and that sort of thing. I think it's much bigger than that though. Like I can remember back when I was at the Biotech Center years ago doing career fairs, and it hasn't changed. I've had conversations with people in the recent years that it's the exact same story, that students will walk by the booth and the question they'll ask is, do you need to know math? Oh, you do? Okay. And then they move on once they realize that math is important, and they don't want to do math. And our industry isn't all over social media in the same way that some of the other industries that are far more attractive, to them are. And so I think that's another whole challenge. But I think, another one that I don't think we talked nearly as much about that we probably need to from an awareness standpoint. There's some good data out there that shows that unfortunately, like pharma as an industry is almost at the bottom of kind of any trustworthiness index that you look at when you look at all the different industries. We're pretty close to the bottom. And that's across party lines. I mean, that's not a party line issue. That's totally bipartisan. We're at the bottom. And when you have parents that don't trust an industry, that rubs off on the students. And of course, they're not gonna seize that. I think what's really sad to me, because at the other hand is, we're talking about a generation that craves meaning and wants meaningful work. I mean, what's not more meaningful than some of what's going on in cell and gene therapy? I mean, we're talking potentially curative medicine, and so if that message can get to the students in the right way, I think we're right on the cusp, the cusp of doing something cool.
Yeah. That's tough. Yeah, that's a tough challenge to overcome for sure. That perception problem. You're right. The parental influence on career choices and decisions. When parents are biased one way or the other, and it seems like every time we make a little bit of progress on that front, we take 2 steps backward shortly thereafter. On the perception front. What is, let's talk for a minute about another level of education. And that's again, there's this perception probably among kids coming out of high school and going into college that if they do want to work on life-changing therapies, they've got to go earn a PhD or an MD or a PharmD, an advanced degree to get in on the game. And obviously we know that's not the case, right? We know that's not the case. We need to change the perception that is the case. Is there work to be done on post-grad academia's, play, right, in shaping the workforce? Is there a faction of the elite that needs to embrace the fact that you don't need to, go to school for 14 years to get a good paying job in biopharma?
I think yes. I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I think the challenge is again so complex when you look at sort of the graduate level and or undergraduate for that matter, in the sense that just as much as the industry needs people, academia needs people too. And if you look at the research, the number of people that are pursuing for or advanced degrees and staying in academia is just as much of a challenge as the sort of the industry's need to kind of lower the education level too. So I think there's opportunity for everybody, and I think that's why one of the soapboxes that I tend to get on all the time, where there's an opportunity, especially when you're talking at sort of the graduate and postgraduate level, is just helping academia, helping students, helping the ecosystem understand that the industry has opportunities for just about anybody from any background. It's not just that PhD chemical engineer or that PhD molecular biologist that should be looking at pharma. It's graduate level data scientists, computer scientists, statisticians, economists for that matter, or communications professionals. The industry really has opportunities for anybody and from all sorts of cross disciplines, and is going to be increasingly more so as some of these new technologies take off within our industry. And so I think that's really an undersold message out there, and a harder one that I don't know that we've necessarily totally solved, is how do you get in and reach not just the students that are in the obvious degree programs, but in the sort of the non-traditional degree programs as well, or non-traditional to pharma degree programs.
It's an interesting point, and I did want to ask you. It's a good segue into another line of questioning I wanted to tackle with you. And so I have a son. My son is starting at Penn State this fall. And he's going to Penn State for engineering. He's been accepted into their pre-engineering program, and he wants to go down there and major in mechanical or aeronautic engineering. He's not sold on which yet. And I've had multiple conversations with him about execs that I've interviewed on this very show who started out in engineering and in our hardcore mechanical type engineering, and now are C-level executives with biopharmaceutical organizations that are doing really cool protein engineering, biologics engineering. The same can be said for IT, right? You look at the IT space, artificial intelligence, machine learning, these kids who have this perception that if I go down that path, I'm a propeller head computer guy. And they don't necessarily see the incredible opportunities in bio right now around the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning, computational biology, these crossover sort of disciplines. It's super exciting, whether it's engineering or IT or bio, they can all come together. And I don't know that I mean, I know that my students, my children are not aware of these interdisciplinary sort of crossovers. So tell me, that leads to the line of questioning around what, like, looking at the next 5, 10, 15 years. You did a great job, John, like kind of reflecting on from 2003, like, back in the day, it was all about getting academia and industry to talk to one another, to recognize one another, to talk about, application. What is that going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Like how is technology and this interdisciplinary approach going to affect? It seems to me it would exacerbate the workforce, I guess, the talent crunch. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think I think you're right. I think it will, and I think it's like when you look at some of the advanced manufacturing technologies that are coming out there in this whole world of automation or AI and machine learning and big data and advanced analytics, all that is going to impact workforce for sure. I don't think it's by any means. I'm somewhat conservative in the sense of I don't think it's that doom and gloom prophecy that it's going to result in a bunch of layoffs and people are going to be out of a job and that sort of thing. I think the nature of jobs will change. I think they'll change slowly, and so I think that's where like one of the questions that I think comes up a lot is, okay, what does tomorrow's workforce need to know about any of those technologies that we just talked about, AI, machine learning, automation, that sort of thing. And I think the reality is, like, at some level, I don't think we're talking about we need a totally new degree program that's going to focus on all this, and that it's because companies are embracing more automation, all of a sudden, the workforce better have a whole new skill set that they need to have that they don't have currently. Because I think, like, I tend to, when I look back 20 years ago, like the skills that our industry needs are still 99% there. It's not like the core skills haven't fundamentally changed. What will change in my mind is kind of what you alluded to in a way, that like folks and students like your son or your kids, like they need to recognize that there's opportunities in there regardless, from coming from these other disciplines, I think, on the one hand, so that our industry, collectively, biotech and biopharma is going to be needing people that come from a lot of these different disciplines. I think at the same time, we're going to need the incoming workforce to not just be a technical expert in topic of their choice, not just be a molecular biologist. They're going to need to be a molecular biologist who also knows a little bit about automation, who knows a little bit about data analytics, who knows a little bit about statistics, that has sort of those broad areas of interest, more of a jack of all trades, if you will, where they may not need to be able to design automation and do all the programming and all that, but they need to be able to talk to people that do. And so I think the industry is going to become increasingly cross-disciplinary, where people need to be able to speak with each other a lot more fluently about all these different topics. I think at the shop floor level, I think the one thing that I've been hearing over the last couple of years in relation to kind of automation and how that's going to impact the workforce is, I think it will create the need for a shop floor workforce that is better able to interpret and analyze and react to data and trend data and what's going on with a given production run. That 10 years ago they could probably just look it up in an SOP and do XYZ. I think now there's going to be an increased need for kind of critical thinking, and I think that's going to be an interesting challenge to figure out how to meet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Critical thinking. In other industries, automation in many cases sort of removes the necessity for critical thinking. You just reminded me of a friend of ours who has no college degree, has worked for a long time in the automotive manufacturing industry in quality control, and he was telling me, he gets paid like triple digits to sit there and like watch an assembly line, and literally there are two lights. One is a green smiley face, and one is a red frowny face. And when the automation factor catches something that should cause the red frowny face to light up, he stops the assembly line, does some QC, checks it out, solves the problem, and gets it going again. But like that level of kind of automation in that industry they're trying to remove as much critical thinking from the equation as necessary on the part of the human. You're saying in bio, like there's an opportunity for, to apply critical thinking when production problems arise. Obviously, it's a much more complex industry.
Yeah, well, but I think it's the nature of the role. I mean, like, the person that you're mentioning that's working in, the auto industry. I mean, I'd probably argue without knowing that whole situation that person's actually doing a lot more critical thinking. Not in the same, like they're not
post frowny face, right?
Well, post frowny face. Well, exactly. And the same thing. They're not, doing the thing to make the thing, but instead of doing that, the job is now morphed into more of a troubleshooting critical thinking role. And I think that's the same within our industry on the shop floor. As automation takes off and, some of those steps are automated, I think the folks that are working on the shop floor, they'll be the ones that are troubleshooting. And when there is that red frowny face, what do you do?
Right.
And, when automation's gone awry.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what other, I guess, parties are relevant to the equation here? Industry. We talked about industry. We talked about high school level education. VOTech, community colleges. Are there other like association level, state, federal, local government level, I guess, plays or vested interests that need to come together and be part of this equation?
Yeah, I'd say, short answer is all of the above.
All the above,
there are all those things.
And more.
And I'd say and more, and increasingly more so. I think there's, in most of the big, strong biotech regions, and even regions that are, more aspirational in nature, there's a lot of interest from, the economic development community, the nonprofits, the, state government, in terms of how to grow all this and bring that ecosystem together, if you will. So I think there's untapped potential for industry to get engaged and be able to offer guidance within the region. And I think understanding, this other probably just general guidance that I'd probably throw out there to anybody, in the industry is know who's in your local community. I mean, just do some research and find out who is your local, bio affiliate, which professional associations do have strong chapters, what colleges or community colleges around. Know your landscape and get involved. I think the other challenge, though, that I could probably mention, along these lines, that's relevant is, before the pandemic, I always got the sense that people got a lot of, and I have had many conversations with peers, and knew a lot of people that they get their energy from kind of giving back to the community and going to an ISPE meeting, or going to go talk to the local college, or meeting with professionals in some region, local chapter. They'd get a lot of energy out of that. It would be a lot of fun. And they do it happily. I think what happened, interestingly during the pandemic is I think people started to guard their personal time a lot more tightly. And instead of doing your work and then shutting down at 5 o'clock and then going to that meeting, because the nature of our work kind of, the boundaries of that initially kind of stretched a lot due to the pandemic, and we were all working virtually and could work wherever. I think people started to realize, okay, I got to be smarter. And when I'm off work, I'm off work, and started kind of drawing a firmer line in the sand. And I think some of that has stuck in terms of that work-life balance, where I think what the situation that I see now is, at least anecdotally, is there are fewer people, from the industry that are using their downtime to kind of give back and get involved in the local community. And so I think I would love to see that come back. I don't know the solution, but I think that's part of the problem also, is that there is less engagement post pandemic than there was before. Yeah.
If you missed that, invite it back, right? Embrace that. I mean, it's trickling back. I think, we're seeing more activity on the road, and hosting more of our own events in person again. And I think it's coming back, just albeit slowly. You're right. There is that. It is the pendulum never stops swinging, right? And when pendulum did swing so far to the point where there were no boundaries at all, I can see where there'd be some justifiable protection of time off the clock, right? Yeah. We're running short on time. I feel like we could sit here and chat about this for hours, John, but we're running short on time. What haven't we spent enough time on here that you think is central or important to the story?
Gosh,
I know.
There's a lot of different directions. I think one word, just a word that we haven't really mentioned that I think, I want to kind of just at least throw out there is just the whole diversity challenge is a challenge and is a central one to solve. And, I think the fortunate thing is, again, I kind of always draw this kind of post-pandemic, pre-pandemic. I think in the last, 5-10 years, it's really kind of been cool and humbling that I think I get the sense that most of the companies have gone from, diversity being the right thing to do to being mission critical. And, I really truly see it as being, mission critical to innovation. And I'm not just talking about, race, ethnicity, social, demographics and everything. Like it's a broad issue, but I think there's a lot of good research out there that, innovation is fueled better by a lot of diverse perspectives. And so I think it's been really kind of cool to see that companies, big and small, are really embracing this as a challenge. I'd say in the last, 3 or 4 years, I've seen, the diversity side of organizations growing, exponentially. And so it's great to see that it's coming into its own. Just anecdotally, NIIMBL runs a diversity initiative, NIIMBL Experience. It's focused on first and second year college students that are Black, Latino, and Native American. And we're coming into our fourth or fifth year, I guess, running that program. And it's been really kind of cool to watch industry change in that time that we've been running that program. And in the early years of running that program, our industry, they had a lot to learn in terms of how to reach students that weren't the rock star chemical engineer or, the student who already had their sights on biopharma. How do you talk to that disadvantaged student who's coming from a totally different background? And I think, our industry's really come around over the last 2 or 3 years. So it's really been kind of cool to see.
That's a tough nut to crack too, and I've read about that program, that program you just referenced, John. And you make the nut tougher to crack, rightfully so. NIIMBL made the nut tougher to crack on its own, because you could very easily say, well, hey, we want to jump on the diversity inclusion bandwagon, and we're going to create a program whereby we try to make biopharma more attractive to minorities. So we're going to go do that in, Research Triangle Park and Philly and San Fran and in Boston at colleges where, hey, we know there's a minority population at Penn. Yeah. Well, they're kind of that minority population is kind of predisposed, right, to making its way in this industry. Yeah. What NIIMBL has done has gone so far as to say, not only are we going to go after, creating a more diverse workforce, but we're going to go do that in underprivileged areas, right? We're going to go to schools that are, where these kids didn't even, regardless of what color they are, they didn't for a minute think that there was an opportunity for them in an industry like this, because they're in a neighborhood or a town where there's just, the perception that there's no opportunity to pursue this kind of career. Am I right? Like well, yeah, you didn't go for the low hanging fruit, right?
But some of that's just serendipitous in a way, in the sense that I don't want to say that was by design, but in the way that the program grew, in the way that, we've kind of pivoted, and I don't want to get off, onto this tangent too long, but in the way that the program grew, it's grown into kind of a model where we're kind of running little different sites around the country where we're running the program in different regions, and kind of leaving it to those regions and those teams to help recruit students and find students. And I think one of the things that's come out of that is we're reaching a lot of little schools that are brand new to me. I mean, and brand new to most of us within NIIMBL, and in some cases local, new to that region, just even hearing about. And, yes, reaching a lot of, HBCU, historically Black and colleges and universities, but also reaching just a lot of, to your earlier point, a lot of smaller colleges that those students normally, regardless of the color of their skin or, their background, just wouldn't normally be exposed to life sciences in general. And so I think that's a huge win, and, just at least a little baby step in the right direction, that we're moving beyond just the engineering schools and finding a way to reach students that are that are coming from more, from smaller schools and different disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So one parting, I guess, piece of actionable advice for the execs who have been, struggling with this, the company leaders. from new and emerging all the way to big bio, the folks who struggle with this shortage, who are vocal about the fact that it exists, but maybe don't know what their role might be in, affecting the problem. What should they do? Who should they turn to? I don't imagine there's like some clearinghouse where you can go like, oh, here's where I can plug in. But what's your advice there?
I think probably the two. Well, so I think probably the two pieces of advice that I've given, or maybe three. I think the first and foremost is try and learn about and embrace some of these non-traditional pathways into the industry. In order to do that, though, is sort of where the kind of the two pieces of advice that I'd probably throw out there come into play. On the one hand, I think our industry needs to do a better job within a single company, even know who's involved. I mean, like, it's amazing how often I talk to, technical leads of a whole program that don't know their HR department, that don't have a strong relationship with their talent acquisition team. And as a result, fingers get thrown all the time in terms of who's at blame for the problem. And so, like, I truly think it's critical that, senior leadership, the technical managers that are doing the hiring, talent acquisition, who's running the process for hiring, HR, who's setting the policies, and sort of job descriptions, all of them need to be talking. And I think it's far too often that everybody gets lost and mired in the day-to-day of their job, where those partnerships are weak at best. And I think strengthening those partnerships alone could go, could raise the ability of a company to meet some of these challenges a lot more. I think the second piece is also, back to what I mentioned before, learn and understand who's in your local ecosystem and look for opportunities to get involved. I think the other thing that I see all the time is, I'll talk to a company, maybe a champion at a company who's very active and engaged with the local community college, but that's one person. And that one person doesn't necessarily have a relationship with the CEO or the site leadership at that company, or doesn't have a relationship with the training lead or talent acquisition. And so, like, if that person leaves, that relationship with that college is dead. Yeah. And it's why it's so important to be talking internally, so that relationship externally with training providers and educators can be strengthened, with the company. So it's not just reliant on one person, and a lot more people are bought in.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. I appreciate it. The work you guys are doing to raise awareness, but also to affect change. I mean, I feel like the awareness part has kind of been building and coming to the point where everybody's aware. Everyone's, you've done a terrific job raising awareness. And now the work you guys are doing to sort of affect change is admirable. And we'll have you on. I feel like we just scratched the surface. We'll have you on for a part two. We'll get a little bit deeper into it. There's a lot to talk about here, good. And it's something we'll keep covering. So we'll get you back on. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me and spending so much time with me.
Hey, happy to be here. It's been fun.
So that's NIIMBL Workforce Director John Balchunas. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, whose commitment to new and emerging biotech is on display at its virtual biotech accelerator, which I encourage you to visit at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. I also invite you to visit bioprocessonline.com/BOB, where you can sign up for a monthly newsletter that's designed exclusively for Business of Biotech listeners. And while you're online, please leave us a review, some feedback, share the podcast with your colleagues. And as always, thanks for listening.